Rats are rarely given proper names like humans. They prefer them to just happen, like Cyrus Big Fur. Although my story in the main is not about Cyrus Big Fur, I do feel it might be of interest for you to know that in a sewer just below Charing Cross Station, Cyrus Big Fur ruled the roost. He was a fearful and fearless big brown rat with a long sniffy nose, and he would have the choice of any floaty foodstuff that made its way to his particular postcode. And so it was, Cyrus Big Fur was an obvious name for the hairiest and scariest rat you could ever see. But the main thrust of my story centres around an equally large rat called Charlie Greentooth. He had one very large green tooth at the front. This big, sharp green tooth distinguished Charlie from the other rodents, and of course that is how he got his unusual moniker. Most of you will think that a rat is a rat, and in most cases that may well be true, but there are always exceptions to any rule, and Charlie Greentooth was one of the few exceptions. What was Charlie's speciality, you might ask, or then again you may not, but I shall tell you anyway. He was one of the few rodents that liked humankind. Yes, indeed, he was one in a million, or maybe he was the only one, who really knows. But what is important to know is that Charlie Greentooth loved humankind. Humanity throughout the ages of man has hated rats. Well, and I suppose it's not so surprising, seeing as they have been one of the main causes of disease and death over the years, an example being the Great Plague of London. Yes, the Black Death was one of the many bad things attributed to rats at large. And of course, it was the same in other cities and towns in that old world. The open sewers were the main cause, and of course, throwing their rubbish onto the streets was, I am sure, part of the cause. Yes, personal and general hygiene was not understood and catered for in the way it is now. As we all know, living enclosed in sewers in our modern world does help in terms of modern-day hygiene, but the rats are not a popular breed, and as I say, their chosen housing does not help their somewhat tarnished reputation in terms of overall cleanliness. It might be said that mushed-up stuff from our waste disposal units must be a luxury in itself for the modern-day rat, so you could say that the rat is a necessary evil. The Greentooths lived in a wooded area very close to a farm, not a filthy sewer. However, it is well known amongst the forest rat that most, if not all, farmers hate them and would and do kill them on sight at every opportunity. This is because some rats, the ones who came from the sewers, have nasty ratty habits that in the main consist of the stealing of food from the farmers' barns at any opportunity, while also leaving ratty deposits in their wake. But the Greentooth clan, by way of their nature, did not make these unwarranted deposits in any of the areas where food was stored or in any of their forest habitat. In truth, their burrows were scrupulously clean, and they would chase away most of the flea-infested vermin that ventured anywhere near their delegated territory. So when people say a rat is a rat, you, my friends, can now argue their case, if, of course, any such case should arise, because, as we all know, there are exceptions to every rule. Now, from an ordinary rat's point of view, it was food at any cost. This for them wasn't stealing as such, because to steal wasn't in his or her vernacular. I suppose if rats had a vocabulary, the word that would predominate would be survival. The point about it is, some do say that rats is rats, That may well be true in most cases, but the fact is that there was a certain individuality in the few, and as I have said, the Greentooths were of that ilk. But it wasn't something that the farmer ever considered. It was survival for him and his children as well. You could say that the farmer and the rat were not so very different after all, but in human terms that wouldn't stand up in a court of law. So, the dislike of all rats was this particular farmer's way. To kill on sight was the only way to save his stores of food. But something changed. Now, as I say, survival was key, and being above the average rat in intelligence, Charlie had figured out where the farmer's traps were and where they were likely to be, and then to avoid them at any cost. How could he do that, you may well ask, so I shall surmise that you want to know, and of course I shall tell you. If you have ambitions to be a writer, or perhaps detective, and want to be the best, you should be able to put yourself in the other man's shoes, and that is what Charlie Greentooth was able to do. He could predict almost to a certainty what the farmer would do next. Perhaps he should have been called Sherlock Greentooth, after Sherlock Holmes, the great detective. Just joking. The grizzled Groon are of the underworld. They live in deep, dark places under the earth. They were, in fact, as their name suggests, a grizzled breed. They had vile, skeletally hands that were always wet with a slimy, slithery dribble that came from their ever-open mouths. They were small, and their tiny, horrid faces were like the worst version of the blood-sucking, dreaded vampire bat. These creatures rarely ate, but when they did, they were ravenous, and their favourite foodstuff was children's toes. But they loved and only ate dirty toes, the toes of children who didn't wash between those little pinkies. It is said that parents of old used to warn their grizzling children of the grizzled Groon's propensity for eating naughty children's toes, and that ungrateful, moaning, grizzling children had to fear the Groon and its helpers. It was a nightmare story of nightmarish proportions that kept most children in line. "Stop moaning! Stop grizzling!" would be the cry, or the grizzled Groons will send their little helpers in the night to gather your dirty toes for a veritable feast, you ungrateful little tykes. Now, was this just folklore, or maybe something that was made up to keep naughty children in line? We shall see. The Groon had helpers, and they were called Tonsils, and as I write, the name toe tonsils comes to mind, and that's it. I shall call them the toe tonsils, because they were the gatherers, the collectors of children's smelly toes, and any other delicacies that the grizzled Groons fancied, which, as I say, in the main, were unwashed toes, the occasional little finger, and worst of all, it has been said, and I can't really believe it to be so, very small babies that disappeared without trace. The grizzled ones rarely ate, maybe once in a blue moon. I, in truth, have never seen a blue moon, so all I can say to you children out there is wash between those toes of yours and look out for the blue moon just before bed. A little boy and a little girl were nearly ready for bed. They had put their toys away like Mummy had asked. Then they kissed their parents good night and tucked themselves into their little beds. The moon was blue, and Charlie Greentooth could smell the danger in the air. When I say smell, perhaps he felt the danger. He shivered. What was it? Something was wrong, and of course the moon was blue. Now, Charlie lived underground with his fine family. They all lived in old burrows vacated by foxes and rabbits over time. And as I have said, the Greentooths were a special breed of rat, bigger and stronger than the average rodent, and it was a brave or silly one who set themselves up to attack one of the Greentooth clan. Even badgers kept away from them because they were fierce fighters, and even if they lost an encounter, which was a rare occurrence, the damage that they would do to any opponent would be too severe for most to contemplate any action against them at all. And so in the main, their burrows were quite safe from predators, except for the odd, silly hunting dog who would get his nose shredded. It was the dead of night. The moon was full and blue, and Charlie couldn't sleep, and as I have intimated earlier, he sensed danger. Not your normal everyday danger. This was different. He could deal with a sniffy badger or a hungry fox. In truth, the whole forest was strangely quiet and full of menace. And not only Charlie could feel this, the other animals were picking up the mood of the moment. And in the main, they stayed inside. This was quite annoying for the birds of prey like the hooty owl and the great eagle. No, they were not too pleased, for the lack of nocturnal action peeved them, for they were in need of their nightly sustenance. Charlie crept out of his second-hand burrow, having told his sons, daughters, and his wives to stay inside. He found himself uncannily drawn towards the farmhouse. Why was this? He couldn't put it together, but he felt a danger lurking. Charlie crept through the undergrowth. He found himself drawn towards the farmhouse, and as he looked up at the little light in the children's bedroom window, everything seemed as it should be. And then it happened. I would like to tell you how the grizzled groon came to be, or indeed how the Tonsils became their nasty little helpers, but I can't be sure. But what I can do is try to understand why there would be such nasty creatures on this earth. I think it is much to do with being self-centred, never having enough. That is, wanting much, much more than you actually need, being jealous of others, so much so that you shrivel up in a ball of nastiness. Green envy cripples most creatures and darkens the soul. And this was the groon, a shriveled-up ball of nastiness, grizzling and moaning their days away with their willing little helpers in tow. I bet you know people like that. Maybe they will turn into the groon or a tonsil. Not a nice thought, is it? Charlie was transfixed. He was completely still, and he couldn't take his eyes off the farmhouse. And then a vile smell met his sensitive nostrils, a smell so vile and noxious that Charlie held his breath as he said to himself, "Dear God, what's that?" The smell was an underground kind of smell of something or someone that had festered, unwashed for a very long time. And then he saw it, not but 10 feet away, a small head popping out of the soft earth. It wasn't much bigger than a horse chestnut, or conker, as you might call it. The little head moved around and seemed to be looking straight at Charlie, but Charlie never moved. The head moved the other way, and then Charlie realised the little creature was trying to adjust its beady eyes to the light of the blue moon. And when I say beady eyes, I do mean beady. For the Tonsils' eyes were just like they had been sewn on, like the raggedy dolls of old. A very strange look indeed, when you marry that up with their little hairy faces and slithery, drippy tongues that were very reminiscent of a lizard. And of course, their little bodies were not an enhancement in any way at all, because they had long, skelety arms and hands like scoopy shovels, and obvious need for the underground creatures, and with their spindly legs, they were a very strange lot indeed. Time passed, and it seemed like forever, but it couldn't have been more than 2 minutes, and then Charlie heard a scratching noise that couldn't have been more than 2 feet away. Another head popped up. Again it moved from side to side and up and down, but didn't see him, and then Charlie realised that the creature couldn't see him, because it was almost blind. Those eyes had absolutely no protection from light, for they had no eyelids at all. The dark was their ever-present master. I suppose, like a mole, the Tonsil's sight was impaired because of all that time spent in complete darkness under the ground. Then Charlie saw that the little vile-smelling creature was smelling, and then he said to himself, "It's a wonder it can smell anything other than itself." And then it came to Charlie. They were the nasty creatures that he had heard of as a youngster, but he really thought it was the stuff of myth and legend. They were, in fact, Tonsils, and they were smelling out dirty children's toes. Maybe they can smell me, and if they can, why don't they show any fear? Thought Charlie. The true fact is that the Tonsils were more afraid of the grizzled groon than anything else, and that was because if they could not or did not bring back any of the children's toes, the Tonsils would be eaten by the grizzled ones in a fit of temper. They didn't taste too good, but a foul-tasting tonsil in a blue moon was better than nothing at all. There were now 10 little sniffy heads sniffing for all they were worth, and then almost in unison they all jumped out of the earth together and made their way towards each other, and then they huddled together rather like sports persons would do before a big game. The huddle lasted for about 5 minutes, and then it broke up, and then they made one line like a search party would do and started to move forward towards the farmhouse. They had picked up the smell of dirty toes. The tonsil is a burrower, and as I have said for this particular exercise, it has ugly little shovel-type hands that help them burrow their way through the soft earth. It also has tiny razor-sharp teeth that can bite off a toe in an instant. Was it painful? You might well ask, and the answer would be no. That is because they lick the toe that they are going to sever with their slithery lizard-type tongue. And as nature would have it, the endangered toe would be anaesthetized. That is, the spittle had a special property very much like an injection at the dentist, or even a venomous snake. Only this vile tonsil spittle didn't kill, and this whole awful exercise was not out of kindness for the sleeping child. It was to stop any screams of pain in the night that would wake up any mums and dads sleeping close by. It was rare for the tonsils to come to the surface. Their movement was slow, and they shuffled like drunken old sailors heading back to the vessel after a skinful. And if there wasn't such serious business at hand, Charlie Greentooth would have laughed himself silly. I mean, to see those odd little creatures struggling towards the farmhouse in a sort of strange hoppy-like manner was certainly comical to Charlie. But even though it was to all intents and purposes quite funny, it was also a unified line of terror, and that in itself was unusual to say the least. But to say the most, there was indeed a very scary situation developing. Now, Charlie thought to warn the farmer somehow, but as I said earlier, farmers don't like rats, and the risk of being shot was quite apparent. Should he turn and let this unnatural event take place without intervention? He knew the answer before he thought the thought. Yes, he would try in some way to warn the farmer without getting shot himself. He could, of course, warn the children, but that would mean frightening them with his ratty presence, and he liked the children, for he had watched them play in the garden on many occasions, and he had thought to join them, but he knew deep down that he would frighten them. And this could result in him being fired on by the farmer's deluxe flintlock blunderbuss. Not a pleasant thought. That was because the farmer filled his blunderbuss with nuts and bolts. I'll give that a miss, Charlie thought. It was a dilemma for Charlie Greentooth, lover of humans. I must be bonkers, the craziest rat that ever lived, thought Charlie. The tonsils were very slow in their approach to the farmhouse, and so Charlie posed himself a question. How on God's earth will they get into the farmhouse? Because it's a chilly night and all the windows are closed. I suppose that they could dig, but that would take forever. After a little contemplation, it hit Charlie. Those little blighters will go for the chimney. He knew that he would have to get onto the roof and somehow try to stop them, but with their little razor teeth and shovel-like hands, it wasn't something to look forward to. The danger from the toe tonsils was, as I have suggested, all too apparent. The roof of the farmhouse was thatched, and the slope made it very slippery. Charlie had to hold fast as he made his way to the chimney. Once there, he climbed up onto the top. This was the highest point of the house itself, and Charlie could see the toe tonsils converging toward the house in their distinctly awkward fashion. Now, Charlie couldn't make a sound because the farmer would surely think that he, Charlie Greentooth, was the protagonist. I mean, how could the farmer know that the big rat was the lover of humankind? He would surely think that his precious ones were in mortal danger. This was Charlie's thinking also. They are in danger, thought Charlie, but not from me. Charlie decided to drop all his negative thoughts and concentrate on the probable fight ahead. Now, very soon, Charlie heard what sounded like short, sharp breaths, and then a small head poked itself through the top hole in the plastic drain pipe. It didn't do too much other than stretch out its little neck upwards and then sniff the air. Charlie sensed that the creature was sniffing for the dirty toes of the sleeping children, but the only way into the house was through him, so he waited. There was just the sound of sniffing and, of course, the vile smell of the tonsil that permeated the night air. Then it happened. The little creature bounced out of the drainpipe, landing awkwardly onto the roof, but as it had done at the top of the drainpipe, it stood cautiously still. And then another little head came up and, as before, stretched its neck and sniffed the night air. After a suitable amount of sniffing, the noxious little creature bounced up as if he was spring-loaded. He landed close to the other sniffing tonsil, and had it not been for the imminent danger lurking, Charlie Greentooth would have a laugh until he burst. To see the two nasty-looking creatures sniffing the night air with their awkward-looking gait, well, my dears, I would defy anyone not to laugh out loud. The two little tonsils stood with their little sniffy noses in the air, trying to pick up the scent of dirty toes. I know you might think that if the farmer's wife was any sort of mother, she would make the children wash between their toes. But the point about it is, the farmer's wife was a busy lady, and after a hard day's work on the farm, you can imagine the workload. Milking the dairy cows, cooking meals for the family, and of course there was a cleaning and upkeep of the house and farm. So when wash time came, the whole business of washing between toes was forgotten. And as I say, a cheesy toe is a very attractive proposition for a tonsil. And of course, as we all know by now, the fear factor drives them on to please their masters, the grizzled grooms, and to be eaten alive bit by bit, arm by arm, leg by leg, by a ravenous groon is not an attractive proposition, I can tell thee. No, not a very good way of spending your last moments being gnawed at by a hateful groon. I know that some of you might pose a question at this point. You might be saying to yourself, if I were a tonsil, I would run for the hills, but that would make its tiny brain ache. The fact is, a tonsil has never made a decision in its very long life, or if it ever did, that was a long time past, and that was their weakness. Charlie watched the two sniffing tonsils for what seemed an age, and then it came to him. They do smell me, but they're confused, for the smell of the children's smelly toes is a powerful force, and decision-making is not their strong point. Charlie was pleased that he was able to put this weakness in full focus, but how could he use it to his advantage? And then an idea came to Charlie. He said to himself, I have to make them change direction, make them do something completely different. But that was easier said than done, because another sniffing head appeared at the top of the drain pipe. Now, Charlie was still looking down at the tonsils from the top of the farmhouse chimney stack, but now there were more sniffy creatures in a line. Do something different, he said to himself. He was still racking his brain for an answer, and then something in his head made him look up at the moon that was still blue. That's when it came completely out of the blue. It was as if the moon itself had spoken. Smelly socks. That's it. Socks. Those dirty, smelly children's foot coverings. So it was that a big rat that loved human beings and didn't know why slid as best he could down the farmhouse chimney. In normal circumstance, he would have scurried down the chimney, but he didn't want to wake the children. When reaching the bottom, as luck would have it, he found himself in the children's bedroom, and Charlie said to himself, how very unusual it is for them to have a main fireplace in a children's bedroom. But anyway, that's not why I'm here. Now, where are those smelly socks? Charlie stood still for a moment and sniffed the air. And then he said to himself, oh, my word, what a stink! If I can smell those stinky toes, it won't be long before the nasty little tonsils on the roof are driven into a frenzy. Charlie was right about that, because by now the little menaces had all arrived on the roof of the farmhouse and were in a sporty type huddle. And if it wasn't for their hideous purpose, it would have been quite sweet. But sweet it wasn't, for it wouldn't be long before they were on the move. Charlie had by now sniffed out the smellies. They were under the children's beds. So he crept under the beds and, without thinking about it, rolled up the smaller sized sock like a hat. He then put the offensive article of clothing on his head, and this time he scurried up the chimney. When he reached the opening at the top, he peeked out. The toe tonsils were still huddled, and all Charlie could hear was a very soft whisper that seemed to be coming from one of the little creatures. And it was. It was coming from one Tonsil who was slightly taller than the others. The tall one was in the middle of the strange gathering, and Charlie thought that must be their leader. It was indeed the leader, and he was much brighter than the average Tonsil. He thought of himself as an honorary Groon, for he had led some successful raids on nearby towns and villages. Now, in most cases, Tonsils don't have names, but this particular Tonsil did have a name. I would like to say that his chosen name was particularly exotic, but I can't. I mean, it would have been nice to have said that his name was Simeon or something of that ilk, but no, his chosen name was Bert. I ask you, of all the names in the known universe, he chose Bert, and he was proud of it. Why, I can only guess. Perhaps it was something he heard on his travels. Anyway, that was not as important as the situation that had developed on the roof of the farmhouse. Now, Charlie, with the aforementioned smelly sock on his head, was contemplating how he could use the Tonsil's singular thought processes against them. An idea was beginning to take shape in his mind. The more he thought about it, the better it seemed. He would get down from the open chimney stack, and whilst on the farmhouse roof itself, he would cause some sort of ruckus, and with a bit of luck, the Tonsils might get a whiff of this rather smelly sock, and he could then lead them away from the open chimney. This thinking was reminiscent of something he had heard from one of the older Greentooths. The old rat had spoken of the lemmings, and in particular the lemming run. What was said was that they, the lemmings, for reasons known only to them, charged en masse, and with one track purpose they all dived off a cliff, landing on the rocks below to certain death. How stupid was that, the young Charlie thought at the time, and then he stored that particular information away, not thinking any more about it until this day. And so it was that Charlie Greentooth might well have to take his life in his hands on this day. When I say take his life in his hands, it was because one of those nasty little Tonsils with their teeth like needles could cause a great deal of harm. There was no doubt in Charlie's mind that the little collective on the roof could cause much damage to his person. So much so that he might never recover. And so, as I have said, without forethought or fixture, a big brave rat, who, as I say, had already made his decision, jumped down from the chimney stack and scurried around the Tonsils, not venturing too close, but making as much noise as he could, hoping to wake the farmer or his wife, or indeed one of the children. But they had all had a busy day, and to coin a phrase, were dead to the world. Charlie could see that the noise that he had made had broken up the Tonsils' huddle, and although the little creatures couldn't see him, they could smell that gross sock secreted on his head, for they were all sniffing in his direction. That was it. No time like the present, thought the brave rat, so he ran towards the sniffing Tonsils. They all but one became restless and made a strange high-pitched noise, rather like a cat's purr, but higher in pitch. I suppose you could say the little violators were excited at the prospect of some delicious toes for their masters, the grizzled Groons. Charlie had stopped 5 feet from the group, and he noticed something very odd that perhaps he could use to his advantage. He saw that every time he moved his head, even just a little bit, the Tonsils' noses moved in the same direction. They were transfixed. Their whole interest was locked onto that smelly sock on Charlie's head. And of course, Charlie knew that the Tonsils couldn't see very well, and that it was their sense of smell that was their biggest weapon. And maybe in all this apparent confusion, he could turn their strength into their weakness. Oh yes, he would turn their smelling faculty against them. While all this confusion was on the rise, there was one who stood his ground and wasn't sniffing on a dirty sock. He wasn't going to be duped or bamboozled by a large rat. He sensed the rat in their midst was trying to stop the show, and he had no plans to allow the interloper to win. He would go back to his masters, the grizzled Groon, in triumph. Now Charlie was ready for his dangerous action, and so he ran towards the edge of the roof with the Tonsils following behind. Charlie jumped out into mid-air, and all the Tonsils but one followed. Charlie watched all this madness in total amazement from his vantage point in an adjacent tree. He had just managed to cling onto a branch, avoiding the carnage below. And seeing the little creatures bursting into flames until they were just ash was not pleasant in any way, shape or form, for not a tonsil had survived the fall, and as the ash blew away on the night wind, you wouldn't have known that anything had happened at all. But it wasn't over yet, for Charlie could see Bert on the top of the chimney stack, grimacing away. Or was that a self-centered smile? The moon was still blue, and now Charlie was more worried than ever before, for he had made the dangerous jump by the skin of his teeth, to coin a phrase, for he had scraped and cut his mouth on the tree bark as he landed. But not to worry, he thought. I have a more pressing thing to worry about. Yes, he certainly did, because Bert had just died down the chimney. Oh, I hope this isn't all for nothing, Charlie said to himself, and then carried on with the same concerned train of thought. I mean, it could be all for nothing, the point of the matter being that I have sent some nasty tonsils to their maker, and the children's toes are still in danger. I'll have to take a chance and jump back on the roof. And that's when he, without much forethought, grabbed a tight hold on a long branch. Charlie Greentooth wasn't a small rat. In fact, I can't think that there would be a rat in the whole world that was as big as Charlie Greentooth. Maybe his son Sidney Whiteears, who was still growing, might get to be as big, or maybe even bigger, but that's another story. You might be saying to yourselves, if he, Charlie Greentooth, could jump to the tree once, then why was he so apprehensive about jumping back to the roof? Well, the fact of the matter was, he couldn't run at it as before. He was stuck in a tree, holding onto a branch that may or may not take his weight. Well, here we go, needs must, he said to himself, and with that scary thought, the big rat swung himself back and forth, and at his highest point he let go of the branch. He then, for a split second, knew what flying must be all about. He stored that thought, because he was now on the way down. It was as if the whole thing was happening in slow motion. He saw the edge of the roof coming at him. He grabbed it by his claw tips, but the hold wasn't enough. He was slipping. That's it, Charlie said to himself, for the brave Charles Greentooth, lover of mankind, was now on his way to his death, or in any case heading towards a very bad injury indeed. And of course the moon was still blue. It was as though time was at a standstill, but for Charlie, help was on hand, to coin a phrase, for his right claw was grabbed, and then his left, and in his dazed state, he looked up, and the first thing he saw was 2 white ears. He was saved! Sidney had been watching from the edge of a wooded area. Charlie Greentooth had told his son to stay in the undergrowth and wait for his return. Thank the gods Sidney had defied his dad, maybe for the first time ever, I might say. Sidney worshipped his daddy, and ever since he had a hair on his ratty chest, he had followed Charlie around, and all the Greentooth clan would laugh, seeing this little thing so besotted, trying to keep up. And funny it may well have been then, but it wasn't so funny now, for Sidney Whiteears had saved his pa good and proper. The night was still, and as a single cloud covered the blue moon, 2 extra-large rats stood on the edge of the farmhouse roof, catching their breath. The fact of the matter was, Sidney hadn't seen the dreaded Bert go down the chimney, and while Sidney was still breathing his sighs of relief, his father ran towards the chimney stack in earnest. Just before Charlie vanished down the chimney, he beckoned his number 1 son to follow. Sidney thought that the death of the Tonsils and the saving of his father from his death fall was a job well done. I mean, it wasn't unreasonable to think that it was the end of these very dangerous happenings. What's my dad up to now, Sidney thought, and then without a second thought he ran to the chimney stack, jumped up, scurried down. It was a sort of standoff, you might say. 2 large rats in the fireplace space, both looking at the rather nasty scene before them. It was 2 children in their beds sleeping, a little boy and a little girl, seemingly oblivious to the horrid scene that was playing out around them. Seeing the 2 large rats guarding his escape route, Bert, who at this time had the little boy's big toe in his mouth, was in a frenzy of excitement. The little boy couldn't feel a thing, for as I said before, Bert had licked every toe on the little one's foot, and rather like being injected in the dentist chair, the youngster could feel nothing. He was dead to the world, meaning he slept like a log, but not the little girl. Well, she had seen some of the desperate goings-on and was in a state of frozen petrification. The little girl, with one eye closed, was pretending sleep and had by this time understood the clear and present danger. She could see the two large rodents by the fireplace through her squinty eye, and she was clever enough to pick up that they weren't there for harmful purpose. In the normal course of such an event, she would have screamed blue murder. In truth, she was so scared that she doubted that she could shout or indeed scream out loud because her little throat was knotted. In truth, she could hardly breathe. She had to do something and try to shoo away the toe-licking offender. But wait a moment, she thought to herself, because the larger rat had jumped onto the little boy's bed. Was Charlie Greentooth too late? For Bert, the leader of the pack of the evil predators, was holding the little boy's big toe in his mouth. The little girl gasped as she saw the horror of the moment. As I have explained, Bert wasn't like the other Tonsils, for he had a plan to get out of this predicament, and knowing that he couldn't get out of the room in this present circumstance, because there was another large rat guarding the only way out, the point being he had a big toe in his mouth, but if he wasn't to get out of this situation alive, well, he said to himself, what good would having a big toe do him? There was an angry silence in the room, nobody really knowing what to do next. It was a so-called standoff. Or was it? Bert had a plan, and it was time to create a deal of confusion in the ranks. When in trouble, do the unexpected, was his thinking, and the brave but thudded little creature spat the little boy's toe in the air towards the fireplace, his gateway to freedom, as it were. And Sidney, without thinking, caught the big toe before it hit the ground. All this as Bert ran past to freedom, or a grizzled groom feast. Not with the children's toes, but himself. He really did have some explaining to do, didn't he? The truth was, he had never failed in his gatherings before, so maybe his nasty masters, the groom, will be lenient. But I can't say that I care one way or the other. Sidney couldn't tell you why he did what he did, until this day. All he would say was that it was possibly the magic of the blue moon. What did he do that was so amazing, you might ask, and I shall tell you. He rushed forward with big toe in his mouth and jumped upon the bed where the youngster lay sleeping, and there it was, a gaping hole where the child's big toe used to be. He, with a degree of tenderness, held the toe between his lower white and large upper green tooth, and then placed the said toe back in its proper place of residence, and as if by magic, it healed in seconds. This could only happen once in a blue moon. The two large rats didn't wait around, because if the farmer saw them in the children's bedroom, even now he wouldn't believe in the madness that had just happened, and as I said, they made their exit in good haste. The little boy awoke and told his sister of his bad dream. She, being the good and kind girl that she was, never told him that the whole thing was real. But in truth, he had a sneaking feeling that it was a real experience. But he kept that scary possibility at the back of his mind, although sometimes, rather like a reminder of the unpleasant happening, it would seem that on certain occasions that big toe would tingle somewhat. This always gave the boy an inkling or an insight into the nature of others, especially fibbers. I mean, even when he himself was bending the truth a tad, his big toe tingled. The farmer was hard pushed to believe what the little girl had told him, especially the toe-grafting blue moon story. But he must have believed it on some level, because the fireplace is now bricked up. I suppose you might say that it's better safe than sorry. Oh, and by the way, the children always leave a sausage or two out at night as a thank you to the Greentooths, and they are always gone in the morning. The children now wash their toes every night, and as an extra precaution, Mummy makes the covers nice and tight around their feet, especially when the moon is blue.
That was Charlie Greentooth and the Toe Tonsils, written by G.H.Dudley, read by Su Pollard.
Nice.
Music, Charlie Greentooth theme, written and performed by Paul Brennan. A father and son production. December 2012.